All right, so we did Let It Bleed, before this. We're going to do Exile after this. Later on, we're going to do Some Girls. So I'm going to kind of curb all but the most essential part of the Sticky Fingers bio. So here we go. This is the 9th British album and the 11th American album by the Stones. There's a story as to why there's a couple more American albums that ties into Mr. Klein, who we mentioned before, Alan Klein, and we'll talk about that in a second. This is the first album on their new label, Rolling Stone Records, after leaving what famous record label, guys, that they'd been on for years?
Columbia?
Oh, no.
Island?
Come on, guys. No. Decca. They were on Decca. They were famous for kind of being the signature act on Decca with their crazy manager, Andrew Oldham, who, had basically had been fired by the band in 68 and been replaced by Alan Klein.
16-year-old? Wasn't he super young?
Yes, he was he's super young. Remember, his mom had to co-sign the band act, stuff like that. Yeah. So this is the first Stones album to reach #1 in both the UK and the US charts, and it's been certified triple platinum. It also featured a #1 single in Brown Sugar. So here are sort of the bullet points that I will mention between Let It Bleed and this album. The first to know is this is Mick Taylor's first album, studio album. He's on the live album Get Your Ya-Ya's Out, which is between Let It Bleed and this. But this is the first one. He replaced Brian Jones, who died, shortly in 1969. Drowning, and at 27, so young. So Mick Taylor's sound is all over this album, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, when we analyze this album. But yes, he has a very distinctive sound, and he is not a long-termer for the Stones as well. He's left by the late 70s as well, which we'll talk about as we get to Some Girls, which is the album after he leaves. Leading up to this album, the Stones found out that their, at this time, former manager, Alan Klein, had sort of hoodwinked them and signed over their entire 1960s American copyrights to his new company, ABKCO. So the band was understandably infuriated by this, and they found out that's why there were all of these American albums that were released, that they were not sure why there was an American version and a British version, right? And some live albums. Well, it turns out that on the sly, Mr. Klein was getting some cash in his pocket. So they sued him for years unsuccessfully, and then finally settled in 1984, but they did not make peace with him. It was contentious along the way. Things were not quite as contentious with Decca, but there still was a point of contention, which was that they owed them one more single, according to Decca. And apparently this was true. The Stones did not love that, and eventually that song became Street Fighting Man as the final single, so not a bad way for Decca to go out. But the band, sort of to be cheeky, submitted a song called Cocksucker Blues, knowing that they would not be able to release that. And it was certainly, it could be both a euphemism and literal, depending on how you chose to read it. But that was the choice they made, which is quintessential Stones, I thought, which was kind of funny.
There's also a famous movie called Cocksucker Blues about them.
There you go. And so that was where that comes from. That was the track that they gave Decca on their way out as sort of a kiss off. So, or something else off. 4 of the tracks from this album were actually recorded during the Let It Bleed sessions. That was Brown Sugar, You Gotta Move, Wild Horses, and Sister Morphine. And they actually, during the sessions for this album, where the rest of the album was recorded, recorded a lot of the songs that would end up on Exile on Main Street, which is not quite as long as All Things Must Pass, but is a double album of its own, which when we get to it. So be prepared, Josh. Yeah, so that's a little bit of the background. The other 2 things that people always talk about this was that the cover was actually an Andy Warhol piece designed by his group of artists called The Collective. The original one was the same picture of the tight jeans with the fly open to the fabric, but it was actually a real working zipper. And Mick Jagger loved this idea. However, the zipper was damaging the vinyl records, and they had to basically move it to just a picture instead, which is the much talked about picture on the front of this album, which is basically a pair of tight jeans, provocatively unzipped a little bit, with a very clear outline of a phallic inside the pants. It has never been known who it was. They think it could be Andy Warhol's boyfriend at the time, or the brother of his boyfriend, or some models that were around. The one thing that has been verified, though, is that it is not Mick Jagger, as was rumored for years. That is not who it was. Everybody has confirmed that. The other thing that came out of this was that this was the first album to feature the tongue and lips logo that the Rolling Stones are most known for.
Oh.
It was a suggestion by Mick Jagger, who told them to model it on the outstuck tongue of the Hindu goddess, I believe Kali is the name of it, Kali. And at first, they were not going to do it because they thought it was too much of a vestige of the 60s, right? Like, mysticism and Indian mysticism. But then when they saw the picture, they're like, yeah, this fits. And sure enough, well, because Mick Jagger, right? And you look at Mick Jagger and... Yeah.
It's also like one of, if not the most iconic symbol in rock and roll. That's just...
I would argue, yes, that they're...
It's like the McDonald's Archers.
Yeah, Mick Jagger's instincts were very much right on this. So this album was basically considered to be a back-to-basics one with little experimentation, like you heard in Aftermath and Let It Bleed and some of the album, and their Satanic Majesties and stuff when they were playing around with stuff. This is just considered and was designed to be a blues album. It features all of the normal players for the Stones. It's got, at various times, Billy Preston and Ian Stewart, who's, as we know, is the member of the band. Remember, he's basically considered a member of the band, but uncredited because of the aesthetics. Nicky Hopkins and Jack Nietzsche, and then Bobby Keys on the sax, so who have been around the Stones for forever. And that's it. I think I'm going to leave there, and let's talk about this album, because I'm interested to hear your takes on this. Matt, let's start with you. Thoughts on Sticky Fingers?
So, actually, is it Josh? I think it's Josh's turn to go first.
It's okay. We'll go with Josh.
I'll go first.
Josh,
this album is awesome. How can you not? How can you not love this album? This is like the tightest the Stones ever are. Every track on this album is amazing. It rolls by. They've got like 5 or 6 amazing hit songs on here, which is incredible in its own right. You hear one song and then the next song you're like, oh my god, this is awesome too. And then you go on to like Can't You Hear Me Knocking, and you're like, oh my god, this is awesome. And yeah, this is does it get better than this on the Stones? This is probably one of their most famous albums, and probably one of their most like best track to track albums that there is. So at least for me, the thing I noticed on this album, or this listen through this time around, was how much the horns play a role in the album and how great they are, especially on like Brown Sugar and Bitch. And the riffs are great on this album, also in Bitch. I noticed some strings and things like Moonlight Mile. And I think the Stones are really good at putting these things in the background or adding to their kind of blues rock aesthetic, and that really like it elevates the album to another level when you're listening to it. On Can't You Hear Me Knocking, did you guys hear kind of the Santana sounding interlude this time around? Before,
well, they got the like the what is it, not the congas, but like the kind of the percussion instrument. What is that, like the blocks or whatever?
No, it's the congas.
I'm thinking of those things where you hold the wooden part and you clack it on the other one. Anyway,
like if you're in elementary school.
Yes, totally. The elementary school percussion instrument. That sounds like Santana.
Yeah. That was a long interlude in the middle of that song, and the guitar during that part also reminded me of Santana. It's just kind of essential Stones. I know it's not something new to say, but you hear all of the great blues riffs and guitar parts that they bring, and then they just add that extra special Rolling Stones magic to the album. And there's not a bad song on here. I think Mick Jagger's singing is great on this. I don't think he gets enough credit for what, the lead. I mean, he gets enough credit, but he's good on this album. And
well, he writes all the songs too, remember? That's something that I think people forget about the Stones, that he's the lyricist. So yeah.
Yep. You get a lot of drug themes on it, especially like Sister Morphine.
On all the tracks, drug themes, by the way.
Yeah.
Drugs and sex is the theme of this album.
That's true. And what else is there? That's all I got right now. What do you got, Matt?
So first of all, what is your background? Because it looks like you're on Tatooine right now.
Oh,
I don't understand the significance
it's Buster
of that.
Keaton rolling from stones, running away from
Oh
rolling
God!
stones.
Wow,
So-
Chuck just making me think on his Zoom background.
Yeah.
Okay. Secondly, I have to give props to my mom. I do remember because she had a copy of this, and it was the zippered copy.
Oh wow. Okay.
And so when you unzip, I remember this. You unzip the copy, and you open it up, and the dude's got it. You see his underwear. So it does it. So for those of you, you're not getting the Lenny Kravitz experience. You're getting just the underwear. So I have to say that this is the first Stones album that I ever owned, and it's the first Stones album that I really knew. I think I got it back in college, like '98 or something like that. I liked it pretty much right away, and I think going into this, I've always known that this is my favorite Stones album, and I think this week listening to it, and upon further reflection, this is like a desert island album for me. This is this is a perfect album. Okay, there is nothing wrong with this album for me. This is hitting all the areas that it needs to hit. You've got straight up rock and roll bangers, some of the best rock and roll songs you'll ever hear, and Brown Sugar and Bitch. That riff in Bitch. I don't know if rock and roll gets better than that. I mean, I don't fine. That's better to me. That's better than Satisfaction. That's better than anything that Guns N' Roses ever did, or any of the heavy hitters in rock and roll. Like, as far as I'm concerned, like that might be my favorite rock and roll song ever. It's so good, and the little part that the icing on the cake is the like that part, so good, such a great song. And then you've got slower songs. You've got kind of like a more sentimental kind of like ballad in something like Wild Horses. You've got more of a dirty blues song in something like I've Got the Blues. You've Got to Move. You've Got to Move is what I meant there. And you've got like Sister Morphine, which is this jar kind of like really as druggy of a song as you can get, with really great chord progressions, really great minor keys, cool sounding progression through that song. And you've got, as John, I think you've mentioned this before, Dead Flowers, which might be the ultimate alt country or country rock song of all time. And you've got Moonlight Mile, which is just this is like I guess as produced as this album gets with that, but it's really done well with the orchestration and the way that it builds. I love this album. There's no way this is not making the top 10 in this decade. This might make the top 10 in the entire podcast that we're doing. This album is fantastic. Nothing like that's. I was just sitting here listening to this going, I don't know why this wouldn't be in that realm for me. This is a fantastic record. I do like Exile on Main Street to me, and I'm going to be interested to listen to that again when we come to it and we cover that album. It's a little bit long is my memory, but this is just like one song after the other, so good. This is vintage Stones, and Mick Taylor. I don't know how much of this is him. I mean, it's not like they're deviating all that much from anything that they've done before. I just think that they're clicking on hitting on all cylinders here. And this is a fantastic record.
Moonlight Mile's such a great ending song too. It just kind of sums up everything.
And I also have to say, my brother texted me, he was listening to this week, and he goes, I think Can't You Hear Me Knocking, the first 30 seconds of that might be my favorite opening 30 seconds of ever. And I would listen, I'm like, yeah, he's not terribly wrong there, because that's a great opening, that guitar riff and the way that the drums kick in and stuff, and Mick Jagger's voice, so good. So good.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys know how I feel about this album. I mean, I love this. This would be on my chart 60 out of 60, except I don't love You Gotta Move. I hate the placement of it. It's the only song on this album I don't love. There's about a 5-minute period of the album that I wish I could excise, and that's, I think Can't You Hear Me Knocking goes about a minute and a half too long, and You Gotta Move does nothing. If you take that away, this is 60 out of 60, because everything else is pretty much perfect. I think we talked about... So let me start by saying this is my favorite Stones lineup by far. I think the combination of Mick Taylor and Keith Richards together and the albums they make is the best Stones combo. Two just absolute fire guitarists, almost playing like double lead, just in different parts. You got Wyman on the bass, Watts on the drums, and then Mick Jagger singing. So this is part of that like period where the Stones can do no wrong for me. I think the Stones have kind of been lost in history a little bit because they're not innovators. They're just a rock band that does rock staples like playing bluesy rock and riffs and stagecraft like really well. So it's not sexy to kind of, list them as one of the most important bands because they weren't necessarily, musically, sonically trendsetters. They just did the sound better than almost anybody else. I mean, they were forerunners in terms of image and stagecraft and shows and stuff. I mean, if you see, the tours they did in 68, 69, and 70, right? They're ahead of their time. That we talked about that in Let It Bleed, right? They're basically redoing it. And I mean, you hear the stories. And one of you guys bought me that book on the Stones. I can't remember who for my birthday one year, but thank you for that. But it talked about their shows and how they'd show up and they wouldn't do any encores, right? And they'd start the show with Bitch. And they just come out, and that riff would start. And it's like, yeah, that's the ultimate show-starting song. You know what I mean? It's like, you can't have a better opening song for a concert to set the table, right? It's like perfect. And I think because of that, the Stones kind of get lost in history a little bit as a great band, which almost sounds weird to say, but I think their image hasn't carried as much as you think it would. And this is the type of album that it's like everybody should listen to be reminded of why the Stones are the Stones, for God's sakes, not the parody kind of, getting older Stones, like just the coolest rock band that ever existed, in their era, and that's what this album is. It's just lean guitar riffs, bluesy riffs, edgy, effortlessly edgy. Not trying to be edgy, it's just effortlessly edgy because these are cool people doing cool things. Another thing to keep in mind is this is where the beginning of the Stones' deviation that ultimately strained them in the 70s and 80s comes from, because Mick Jagger gets married to Bianca Jagger in 1970 and becomes like a A-list celebrity, right? He's trying to basically transcend the rock world and become a celebrity, right? Like cultural icon. Meanwhile, Keith Richards is like slumming it with Graham Parsons, doing, shit tons of drugs and, alcohol and just basically, kind of becoming, a borderline junkie, right, during this time. But that's where this like country sound comes from, and the addition of Mick Jagger, and I like Brian Jones, right? I thought he added quite a bit, especially later in it. Aftermath in particular is his finest moment, but the addition of Mick Taylor and to Keith Richards' sound is what to me is the quintessential Stones sound. And Josh mentioned this is when they're tightest. It's funny, like the Stones managed to be both tight and completely loose at the same time. They have the blues looseness, but they play blues tight, which is almost like oxymoronic, but that's what makes the Stones, right? That they can do a tight blues sound. It's crazy, but that's what this album is. Yeah, I mean, this is, on my chart, I ranked this as a 58 out of 60. It's the highest album I've ranked so far.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's nearly a perfect album. I totally could understand if somebody ranked it as an album. I gave the reason why I didn't consider it to be a perfect album, but that's a pittance, compared to what the rest of this album is. Yeah. Highest recommend I can give. It's rock and roll at its best form. I think the other thing I want to mention, guys, is that I think the Stones kind of also have declined a little bit in terms of prestige because they're not a very politically correct band, and I don't want to go into that area, but like, Sticky Fingers, right? we know what that's about, you know what I mean? Like putting they're unabashedly, like uncomfortably visceral, in a way that I don't think people like bands to be anymore. And when you go back and hear this, I think it's a little bit of a shame because this is now there's albums we've been covering, right, that you just can't see released in the modern landscape, like that Serge Gainsbourg album and this one. And we pretty much all agree that these albums are awesome. And so I just wonder a little bit if, like, we need to kind of get back to a little bit of, like, music as a device to make you uncomfortable at times, like when done right. Yeah.
I hope not. I mean, okay, like, get over it. Like, this is just great music,
But could you see somebody releasing this now?
But it's not even that bad, right? Like, if you look at, like, some stuff that's been done over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's way more, like overt stuff than this. And, like, people that are going to get, like, all bent out of shape because, like, it's called Sticky Fingers or because the song is called Bitch. It's like...
Well, they'd say it's misogynistic or brown sugar is culturally appropriate about, basically brown sugar is about not just having sex with, but, like, having, like, visceral sex with, you know, a black woman, you know,
Yeah.
and I could see, you know what I mean? And like, I don't know how many bands would write a song like that from the perspective of a white guy nowadays. And
that's true.
And
right.
Is it a bad thing or a good thing? I can't say, but you just know that no one would write that song now. And that's why I think the Stones kind of ascended, because who's going to be the Stones in this era? Like, the last like cool band like this was like the Strokes, right? And even they kind of fell off the track. But I mean, the Strokes kind of were doing the Velvet Underground mixed with like the Stones
they kind of have
here.
a different vibe too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that's where like the like I totally could get past the lyrics, because I'm not even like when I hear Brown Sugar or when I hear, you know, Bitch, I'm not thinking about it. I am 100% locked in on the riff, on the music, and like how I feel about it, you know.
Yeah.
So I see what you're saying, but like I don't know. I hope that people don't overlook this, because it's just like, oh, this is so, rock and roll doesn't get any better than this. Like I don't think it does, you know. Like I don't.
This album makes you move too. I was definitely like, as soon as you start hearing the opening riffs of Brown Sugar, you want to start dancing. Also,
we haven't even mentioned Wild Horses, which is an awesome ballad.
That's what I was going to bring up. It's such like an amazing, the fact that they can do this kind of amazing, lovely, heartful ballad, alongside all these other songs, is pretty incredible.
And they'd continue that. And shout out to my friends Jeff and Steve, because we've spent many a night driving home imitating Mick Jagger singing Angie.
Oh, yeah.
So, which is to me an extension of that. So yes, and that's that's the cool thing. You could have Brown Sugar, and then 2 songs later you could try to do Mick Jagger voice on a ballad in Wild Horses, and then get basically, you know, a true blues song, you know, and a slow rambling blues song like You Gotta Move, and then Dead Flowers, which is alt country when they nailed it best.
I think they really did. Yeah. And I would say too, I get why you say why you're going to knock this a couple of points, John, because of those 2 things. I mean, for me, you know, I'm okay with longer songs. I like what they do with Can't You Hear Me Knockin'. It's kind of, it's, you know, and again, they're only doing it once. It's not like they're doing it every song, but they do kind of take it into this longer jam, and I like it. So I'm totally fine with that. It kind of is a unique song in that regard. You Gotta Move is I think that one would stand out to be the most, quote unquote, I don't want to say unpleasant, but like the lowest quality song, because it's almost, it's a cover, right? I mean, that's not, So, but it's kind of like a lo-fi. They're kind of, they're not goofing around, but you can tell that it's not of a serious type of song maybe as the other ones that they're doing. I don't know the best wording for it, but like I still think it sounds great. The lo-fi sound to it, it's a dirtier kind of raunchier song, like sonically anyway.
I always considered it like the drugs they did before they got the high, which led into Bitch. I feel like that's what it is, right? Like it's basically that sound of it. That song sounds like drugs, right? Like doing it and, you know, getting high, and then that song kind of is the interlude, and then after it, it's like, woo, got my high now, and now we're going to do Bitch. But I always felt sort of like that's what the vibe is with that, Yeah,
and I would say that it's still, to me, it's still catchy, right? Even though it's not as like, I'm not going to say it's good as all the other songs on it, but it's still I still like it a lot. You know, I think I don't mind the placement of it. I think it actually, and I agree. I think that actually the way that it ends and leads into Bitch, it's like a perfect boom, like getting you going again, you know. So I love the placement of all the songs. I just but I get what you're saying, and I'm not gonna, you know.
Well, and I mean, Mick Jagger is clearly singing as a black man on that track, by the way, too. He's literally trying to sing like an old school Southern, you know, blues singer, you know. And once again, like, who would try that in today's day and age? Would anybody? You know, and like the question is, should they or should they? You know, like I think it's a question to be asked, but that's like the thing that comes to me. It's like, I don't know if you can release this album nowadays, and I don't know how I feel about that. You know, it's I don't mean to go down that road, but I'd be interested to hear listener feedback on that too. You know, can somebody release this album right now, or would people say it's problematic? So
right.
I see what you're saying. I just think that the way that music has progressed, and how like in all different kinds of genres, how explicit music has gotten, to me this seems like this doesn't seem as big of a stretch as some of the other albums that have gotten radio play, that have gotten play on MTV or music videos, YouTube or whatever. Like, I think music's gotten way more explicit over the years. So I don't think that this is that offensive, and I'd be shocked if there was like a big backlash against this album when it's just like there's so many other examples of things, to me anyway,
right,
that I think are way more explicit about
like
drugs or
WAP.
sex or whatever. Exactly, right? It's like, so that to me would be a stretch. I don't know. Maybe you've read some things or heard some things that I haven't, but I hope not, because it doesn't seem to me. I don't know. People take things differently, but
I haven't. I think it's like people look at the Stones as of their era, and you kind of have to. But I just think it's interesting because it's like you'd love to hear more music like this, and the Stones were so reflective of that blues sound. And I think the other thing that stands out to me, and this is probably my last comment, is at the time when the Stones were doing this, tons of people were doing this, but the Stones did it better than anybody else. Now, this, you know what I mean? People don't make this type of blues,
yes,
dripping rock. They're either they do, but it's even those
radio.
acts are. Well, it's like Gary Clark Jr., right? I'm totally blank. Clark Jr., right? The guitarist. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Gary Clark Jr., right? It's like he's doing that, but he can't be any younger than mid-40s, right? And so you just don't see people doing this type of blues music in the mainstream anymore. It kind of like fell off, and so much music in this era was influenced by that sound. So many albums we've done in the last couple weeks. So,
music's progressed, and I would say that yes, I think that's certainly a conversation we can
and
have
in a good way, not in a bad way, yeah.
Yeah, but it's noticeable, right? If you look at what's at the top of the charts, there's first of all, there's all single artists. It's all like one person. Yeah. There's no bands, right? Let alone rock bands or blues bands. This is not something that's making they're still out there, right? There's still bands and musicians that are doing this stuff, but they're playing small clubs and they are not selling tons of albums. It's just, I would say that that's more of just a natural progression of music and how it's gone and what's popular on the charts now, as opposed to like the message or the image more so than anything. It's just like it's a progression of music. It's just how it's going.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Shifting trends in the music.
Yeah,
I'm sure they'll come back around at some point.
And I'm not a person that this is better or worse. In fact, I think I bang the drum as much as anybody for modern music. And if you look at our Twitter account just the other day, right? But it is very interesting to see that this was very much in the mainstream there, and you just don't see albums like this nowadays.
Not at all.
And so it just shows how music can change and has its ebbs and flows. So I hope that some people are taking notes and get a little bit of the vibe of the Stones. Maybe if it even's just wanting to be a rock star, or that kind of image. I'd like to see a few more rock stars in the world. The world's more interesting.
Also, this album is 50 years old this year, so
that's crazy.
So what is 30 years from now, some teenager's going to be like, oh, the Rolling Stones, they're so awesome, and then there'll be like a blues revival or something.
That's my hope, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would also have to say, remember, I think I showed you guys, like, my brother got me that 1971 book that I've been reading on the cover. I think I took a picture and sent a picture of the cover to you. And on the cover of that picture, of that book is it's almost like a hotel room. I think John made the comment that it looked like a sex mansion, but it was Keith Richards and Graham Parsons. That was the other nice. That was the people on the cover of that book.
So yeah, I think that's as good a place to start as any. Like, run over grandma to get this album, I think is the take of all three of us right here. It's a phenomenal album, probably one of the easiest ones to recommend that we've done.